Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alan Barry Labucan. I'm the host of the show and the founder of the Alan Barry Reports. Today, I have a topic that's near and dear to my heart that I want to talk about. Um, Being in the mining business for over 2 decades now, I've and also being First Nations. I've had to deal with a lot of racism in the industry over the years. I would say that things have improved over the years. I also met some very good people that were interested in doing things the right way. I have some principles about what I think is the right way to deal with First Nations and be a bridge builder between First Nations and industry. But sometimes we see these actions that take the industry backwards a step. When I've seen a lot of steps in the right direction. Now, I'm not going to give the industry a for effort or anything like that, but I certainly see a lot of improvement from when I first got in the business in the early 90s. Lately, there's been the latest sort of dust up between a publicly traded company and a First Nations group is between the company called Doubleview Capital. Doubleview Capital is a junior exploration company that's involved with a project up in the Chesley Valley. And there was a blockade of their project by a group led by Chad Norman Day. Chad Norman Day is the president of the Tahltan central government, and including himself in that was also a group of elders. Now, being First Nations, I can tell you that when the elders show up, things are getting pretty serious. My advice to public companies has always been to be on much more proactive to try to prevent a problem before it happens. And in this case, they didn't, and now they have a problem. As I said, the Mr. Day and his group of elders from the Tahltan group blockaded the project that Doubleview is currently exploring in the Chesley Valley. Now, as soon as they did that blockade, of course, the local newspapers, the Vancouver Sun and Province, come up with stories, as does Stockwatch. Stockwatch is sort of the publication of record for the mining industry. I think they've been at it for 4 decades or something like that. And over the time, I've had to deal with a lot of race baiting headlines from that publication. Trying to keep up on the industry, I would have to read the publication, and then I'd have to listen to these childish little stereotypes. The way how children say things in the playground when they're trying to make their other group angry. Yeah, those kind of comments, little childish, snide comments in their headlines. And in a lot of online publications, what's that called is race-based headline. Trying to create an audience for your publication without any regard for the First Nations that are involved. I had a heated discussion in a chat room with one of the employees of Stockwatch, and he was trying to justify their old actions and say, well, we don't do that anymore. I would add that, they may not write those ignorant headlines anymore, but they certainly, I don't ever remember them apologizing for those ignorant and racist race baiting headlines. But apparently they don't do it. I haven't checked the website to go and see if any of the old news releases have been altered at all. So even though they may not have done it in the past, those are still out there in the public record. Now, another thing that these newspapers and Stockwatch do is very shoddy reporting. These publications for a long time have sort of been, in the case of Stockwatch, really trying to sell their publication, and their market is really the mining sector. And a lot of times there's been a lot of ignorance in the mining sector towards First Nations. Again, I would say that things are improving. There's a lot more better people in the industry now, but that is a legacy that is not that far in our rearview mirrors. In fact, I don't think it is that far at all. I think that these publications have already had to sort of change their attitude a little bit, but they still do their shoddy reporting, which ends up with the same net result. By doing that shoddy reporting, such as if they would have done a little bit of homework, they could have, instead of just saying that, Chad Norman Day, they made him out to be a young guy. They forgot to tell you that he's a lawyer, that he was part of government group, First Nations government groups in the past. They make him out to be some sort of rabble-rousing kid or something like that, when in fact he's a lawyer. A little more homework would have led you to understand that the project that they're talking about, that Doubleview owns, and seems to be the only one. I've been following this Chesley area for a few years. Seems to be the only one that Chad and his group have come out against. And what the reasoning behind their blockade is that this is an important fishing river, goes through the project, and also it was a place of burial grounds. Now, the net result of when this all came out, by not reporting properly and giving people all the details, it creates animosity, and it fuels the fire of all these ignorant, racist, anonymous trolls online who come out and then start saying things like, "Oh, the only reason for this is a money grab." Well, the only reason for this is they haven't approached any of the other groups. I haven't seen them blockade any other, and I certainly haven't. And I just recently, another company has announced an upcoming drill program. Haven't heard anything about that. So seems to be maybe a Doubleview type of a problem. And instead of trying to deal with the problem in a more professional fashion, which to me would have been, instead of suing Mr. Day and the elders, and ultimately what they're doing with that lawsuit is trying to prevent the elders and Mr. Day from protesting about the property that they have a problem with. Instead of, maybe they could have said, well, here's the efforts we made to consult. Didn't hear a word from that in the news releases with the group, and also they could that's a serious one, consulting with the local First Nations. But here's another crucially important one: didn't say anything about any archaeological studies. Now, if I've been involved with these kind of projects as a consultant to public companies, and one of the first things we did was to get in there and try to assess issues regarding First Nations issues, and try to be upfront with the elders, find out any areas of concern, and we even had to go to the lengths of doing an archaeological study before we even got our drilling permits. So that's the more responsible way to do it. Instead, what Doubleview does is one of the dumbest moves I've seen in a very long time. They take a lawsuit against Chad Norman Day. I believe they included unnamed people because they didn't have the names of some of the protesters that were out there. And what they're fundamentally trying to do there is to prevent this group, who I don't think was consulted. I may be wrong on that. Doubleview could certainly correct me on that if I'm wrong. But thorough consulting, including archaeological studies, is probably a better way for the company to spend their money than trying to have a lawsuit that prevents elders and Mr. Day from protesting their project. And so I would like to see things going in a better direction on these kind of projects. What the industry has had a hard time doing is understanding the Constitution of the country, and the Supreme Court rulings in the country. It is clear now that every project, even areas such as British Columbia, where there's not treaties in place, you have to consult with the First Nations. I always recommend companies go even further when they're asking me for consultation on how to do things where there's in areas where you have First Nations involved. And there's three key principles, and it's not just that these principles are sort of some kind of how do you say it, sort of marketing words. These have to be embraced, and those are quite simply respect, consultation, and inclusion. And I'm not talking about the inclusion that the industry is usually kind of used to, which is, kind of the lower hanging fruit of the jobs go to the First Nations. I'd like to see more involvement trying to push the First Nations up the corporate ladder into leadership positions. But, that's a dream that I've had a long time. And, fortunately, I'm one that has kind of led that way. I am in that position now. So why this gets back to me is so important is, one, I want this country to be one I can be proud of. Not living up to the Constitution. In a province like British Columbia, I think companies have to be extra careful because in this province, the provincial government and the federal government have chose to ignore the Constitution. One of the things that are protected in the Constitution is the Royal Proclamations. In those Royal Proclamations, all of Canada is supposed to have gone under treaty, and those are protected in the Constitution right now. And so in British Columbia, I think you have to take extra care, not these kind of situations where taking First Nations to court to have them not protest. That is ridiculous. I can't believe that that they would even try that. I think it's a foolish move. I think those foolish moves do our sector a disservice. And when you do this sector a disservice, the mining, the oil and gas sectors, what the net result is a loss of jobs. First Nations people need jobs. The mining sector need jobs. In order to get there and build that bridge, it requires a few things. It requires publications like Stockwatch and these other newspapers instead of trying to throw fuel on the fire, why not do a realistic job of reporting? Tell the people what's actually going on. Tell them about why the blockade is happening, not be dismissive about it or use race-based headlines. Or even, I'd like to see these publications come into the 21st century and realize that the proper way to address a group of Indigenous people is as First Nations, not as Indians. I'll give you those publications a little insight into history. People from India are called Indians. Christopher Columbus was lost. He thought he was in India when he actually landed in the Americas. So now we have the Indian people from India have to be called East Indians by most Canadians and Americans, so they know the difference between an American Indian or a North American Indian and someone who's actually from India. The most respectful way to refer to me would be as Cree. I'm Cree, and if you're talking about a group of us, it would be nice to be referred to as First Nations. Publications like The Sun or I'm not so sure if The Sun is as bad as it, but the folks over at Stockwatch certainly are. They don't think that they need to come into the 21st century. They're still saying that, well, this is what the Indian Act says. Well, the Indian Act happens to be, as far as First Nations are concerned, the instrument of genocide in this country. So by protecting the Indian Act more than the Constitution, I think is pretty sad state of affairs for the publication, but I don't run that publication. Nonetheless, I do have an opportunity to vent my frustration, and I certainly have some. Again, jobs are really important to First Nations people. We need more jobs of the First Nations people in this country. We need the country to grow up. We need the country to start listening to its constitution. We need corporations in the country to start living up to their constitutional responsibilities. And we don't need publications fueling the fire of ignorant racists who are hiding behind anonymous names and are trolls online. Having said that, it is my hope that more companies continue to move in the direction of consulting with First Nations. They have to. It's the court order. The courts of this country have ordered it. Trying to fight that battle is, well, you could take it to court and appeal it. I'm sure it has been appealed, and I'm sure you'll end up losing because the Constitution is pretty straightforward on these issues. So, being a mining entrepreneur who happens to be First Nations, I do have some issues with some things. I do believe that the industry is going in a better direction. I don't think that we need these backward steps because of foolish actions by companies that haven't done their work properly, and publications and media and stuff like that, I think, need to grow up as well. This is the 21st century. We do have a constitution in Canada. It's time to start, acting like that. On that note, I will say thank you very much for joining us, and have a great day. And don't forget, check out my website, allenberryreports.com.